For all the influence that Muhammad, the final prophet of Islam, has had on our modern world, one important aspect of his life goes relatively unknown to the general public. How exactly did he lead his faithful from persecution to dominance over the whole of Arabia? And what trials and tribulations did he face to protect his community in such a harsh, unforgiving land? Join us to learn of the wars of Muhammad and their tales of hope, despair, loyalty, betrayal, and of those first martyrs whose blood would spill on the hot desert sands. The story of Muhammad begins in Mecca, a large mountain town in the high desert plateau of the Hejaz region in western Arabia. Mecca was a religious hub, home to a sacred cube known as the Kaaba, said to have been built by the prophet Abraham and his son Ishmael, which was surrounded by many idols to minor spirits and deities. Pilgrims would flock to Mecca from all corners of the peninsula, seeking to visit the Kaaba and cleanse themselves spiritually by praying in its presence and worshipping the many idols it shared the city with. Mecca was also a major economic hub for the area, being the base of the Quraysh tribe, traders who controlled the western Arabic trade routes between Africa, Asia, and the Mediterranean. Muhammad was born in Mecca in 570 AD, to parents Abdullah bin al-Muttalib and Amina bint Wahab, who gave him his name stemming from the Arabic verb hamada, meaning to praise or to glorify. They were members of the Banu Hashim clan within the broader Quraysh tribe, an important clan charged with acting as caretakers of the pilgrims who travelled to worship at the Kaaba. Unfortunately, at the time of Muhammad's birth, his family had fallen on hard times, with his father dying shortly before Muhammad was born. He was raised by his mother for some time, until, as was customary for settled Arabic peoples, he was sent to live with a nomadic Bedouin tribe. He still kept close contact with his family, however, and his mother would visit him from time to time. Around the age of 5 or 6, Muhammad's mother took him to the town of Yathrib to visit his father's grave. This trip would end tragically, as she too died of illness on the return journey. Now an orphan, Muhammad's nomadic caretakers would end up placing him under the protection of his grandfather, Abdul al-Muttalib, the Qurayshi leader who controlled pilgrimage concessions within Mecca. Here, observing his grandfather, Muhammad would begin to learn the basics of statecraft. At the age of 8, his grandfather too died, and passed Muhammad into the care of his paternal uncle, Abu Talib, who he would stay with for the rest of his childhood. He began working as a shepherd to help Abu Talib make money, and as a teen, he started acting as his uncle's assistant, travelling in caravans to trade centres as far away as Syria. On these trips, he would be granted the nicknames Al-Amin, the trustworthy, and Al-Sadiq, the truthful, for his honest and reliable personality. Eventually, in his early 20s, he came under the employ of the wealthy Meccan widow, Khadija bint Khawalaid. She too was impressed by his honesty and character, and the two quickly fell in love and were married. Muhammad would spend almost 2 decades happy and content with Khadija, managing her businesses and having 6 children with her. Over these 20 years, Mecca would witness a period of unforeseen growth brought on by its merchant ruling class. The influx of wealth that came with this growth would gradually begin changing the culture of the city, its people placing more and more emphasis on displays of wealth rather than devotion to religion and the customs of old. One custom that did, however, experience an increase in prominence was the worship of idols, physical representations of gods or spirits that was prominent in the pagan Arabic religions of the time. This new materialism and old idolatry bothered Muhammad, who began fasting and meditating in a mountain cave outside town, sometimes for days at a time. According to the Quran, after many indistinct experiences over many years, one day the angel Gabriel appeared before Muhammad as clear as day and gave to him verses spoken by God, which would later be passed to his disciples and recorded in the Quran. It took several years for Muhammad to tell those outside of his family and his close friends about his experiences. However, eventually Gabriel would appear again and command him to start preaching and spreading the word of Islam far and wide. In these first sermons, Muhammad would outline some of the core tenets of his faith. He emphasized the oneness of God, that no others should be worshipped apart from him. He described the nature of heaven and hell, and how people would be judged by God on the day of their deaths to determine where they would be placed. He spoke of both the power and the mercy of God, and he outlined the responsibilities of his followers to protect the weak, provide for the needy, and forsake greed and vice. At first, the Muslims were ridiculed by the Quraysh, and only a small amount joined him. These converts were mostly outcasts, second sons, nobles of declining houses, slaves and foreigners, people whom Muhammad's message of uprooting the social order resonated with. Quickly, the severity of this ridicule began increasing, and the Meccans began persecuting Muhammad and his followers for departing from the traditional ways. The power and wealth of the Meccan leaders revolved around the Kaaba and its idols, and pilgrimages from followers of the pagan Arabic religions which Islam threatened. During the first stages of this persecution, slaves were tortured by their masters, and freedmen had offal, dust and rocks thrown at them. To stop Muhammad's preaching, Qurayshi merchants tried another approach, offering him a chance to join their inner circles and an advantageous marriage. This failed, however, and he remained resolute in his determination to spread Islam. Soon, the persecution of the Muslims by the Meccans grew deadly. Stories of this persecution are often murky and vary in details. However, in one, Sumayya bint Hayat became the first martyr of Islam. A slave of the leader of the anti-Muslim faction within Mecca, Amr ibn Hisham, her side was pierced with a spear by her master after refusing to give up her faith. For several years while still in Mecca, the Quraysh banned trade with the Muslims, leading to terrible conditions. The starvation and deprivation led Muhammad to allow some Muslims to emigrate to the more tolerant Christian kingdom of Aksum in Ethiopia, where they might be free to live unmolested. In 619 AD, both Khadija and Abu Talib tragically passed away. Muhammad's protection was gone with his uncle dead, and he had to flee Mecca for a time. He tried to find safety in the town of Taif, but was so badly attacked that his feet became clotted to his shoes from the blood that had poured into them. Only through the protection of a man named Mutim ibn Adi could he return to Mecca, where he would embark on his famous Isra and Miraj, a one-night journey where, according to the Quran, the angel Gabriel first led him to Jerusalem and then to heaven and hell, where he spoke with God and the prophets who came before him. One day, a delegation from the town of Yathrib invited Muhammad to the town as a neutral arbitrator in their civil unrest. The Muslims of Yathrib, who made up a significant proportion of the town's Arab tribes, promised him protection, and, fearing further persecution in Mecca, Muhammad accepted. Muhammad instructed all his followers from Arabia and Aksum to accompany him and settle in Yathrib. These initial followers became known as the Muhajirun, meaning the emigrants. This flight came none too soon, as on the night of leaving Mecca, the leaders of the city attempted to have Muhammad assassinated. However, the plot would be foiled. His cousin Ali, one of the first Muslim converts years ago when he was but a boy, slept in Muhammad's bed that night while Muhammad escaped unharmed. Ali would join Muhammad in his flight north when the assassins ripped the blanket from the bed and finally realized they had been deceived. Muhammad's flight to Yathrib is known to Muslims as the Hijra, and its year marks the year 0 in the Islamic calendar. The town of Yathrib was an agricultural oasis north of Mecca in the same Hejaz region of Arabia. Its population was divided up into many small Arab tribes, of which the Aus and the Khazraj were the greatest, and 3 significant Jewish tribes, the Banu Qaynuqa, Banu Nadir, and Banu Qurayza. When he arrived, Yathrib was experiencing a period of violence and mistrust between its inhabitants. with deep-rooted feuds harming the stability of the city. Muhammad mediated peace between the tribes, established his position as the leader of Yathrib, and drafted a rudimentary constitution. This constitution specified the rights and duties of the citizen and defined the relationships between different groups within the community. This accomplished, many more Arabs from Yathrib began converting to Islam, those from the Aus and Khazraj becoming known as the Ansar, the helpers. As the number of Muslims began to dwarf the rest of Yathrib's population, the town started being referred to as Medina, a shortening of Al-Madina an-Nabawiyya, the city of the Prophet. In July of 622, Muslims began organizing raids of Qurayshi caravans to acquire trade goods and food. Medina couldn't support all its new inhabitants with its own produce, since many of the new immigrants came from the barren land of Mecca and had no skill as farmers. This behaviour was justified as taking back the property that was seized when the Muhajirun fled Mecca and fighting against those that persecuted them. Most of the initial raids ended in failure. The first 2 were driven off by escorts, and the next 4 never found their targets. Fearing that this was due to the actions of a spy in their ranks, Muhammad started using sealed letters of instruction to be opened only after a raiding party had departed from Medina. Such a policy began with Abdullah ibn Jahsh, who was ordered to gather intelligence on Qurayshi caravan movements near Mecca. His band spotted a lightly defended caravan and, unsure whether they were still in a holy month where fighting was banned, decided to attack it anyway. Their raid was successful. However, they ended up killing one man, Amr ibn al-Hadrami, the first person to be killed for the cause of Islam. With knowledge of Qurayshi trading patterns and his own spies in Mecca, Muhammad knew that a large caravan of 1,000 camels, led by Abu Sufyan ibn Harb, was on its way back from Syria. This caravan was one of those that had evaded the Muslims earlier on its way north. However, now it was returning, it was weighed down by its treasure and predictable in its movements. To bring down this Goliath and overpower its many guards, Muhammad drafted the Ansar into his army for the first time, heading out to find the caravan with 313 men, 70 camels, and 2 horses. To hide his advance from Qurayshi scouts, Muhammad's force deviated from the main west road and followed obscure canyons and wadis until they reached the proposed ambush site of Badr, where they made camp and prepared for the fight to come. Unknown to the Muslims, Abu Sufyan had posted scouts ahead of his caravan and knew of their presence. The 8th century Islamic historian Ibn Ishaq tells that Sufyan discovered the ambush personally, inspecting fresh camel droppings and finding a date pip inside, a fruit commonly eaten in Medina. Abu Sufyan quickly sent a rider to Mecca, who, in his desperation to be taken seriously by the Quraysh, cut off the nose and ears of his camel upon reaching the city. The caravan had been invested in by almost every wealthy family in Mecca, and its loss would be disastrous for all of them. The Meccans quickly gathered an army of 1,300 men and 100 horses, and marched hard north to meet the Muslims. Abu Sufyan also took action to avoid Muhammad's raiding party, changing his caravan's route from the inland road through Badr to the coastal road along the Red Sea. In this way, the caravan succeeded at avoiding the Muslim ambush and continued on unmolested to Mecca. 300 of the relief force decided to accompany the caravan back to the city, unwilling to fight now that their wealth was secure. However, the leader of the expedition, the head of Mecca's anti-Muslim faction, Amr ibn Hisham, led the rest of his men onwards. The man who had taken the first Muslim life was coming to claim his glory by drenching the desert in even more blood. Muhammad only learned of the relief force the day before the battle when his men captured 2 Qurayshi water-bearers. He realized immediately that with the number of horses in his enemy's army, retreat would be impossible, lest his men be ran down on their way back to Medina. For the Muslims, this would be a battle for survival against a force 3 times their size, and only their wit and their courage could save them. The terrain of Badr is made up by a flat, pinched bowl of desert plains, surrounded by mountains and ridges. Its only openings to the outside world are to the southeast, leading to Mecca, the northwest to Syria, and the northeast to Medina. In Muhammad's time, Badr was the site of multiple wells stretching across its eastern side that provided water for passing caravans on their route up and down the Hejaz. These wells would form the key part of the Muslim strategy to give them an advantage over their enemies. One of Muhammad's officers had suggested to him that they block up the wells in the south to deprive the Quraysh of any readily available water, while creating a cistern in the north to give their forces an ample supply and keep up their strength. Muhammad readily agreed to this, and the Muslim army set about gathering rocks, sand and dirt to fill in the southern wells. Soon the Meccans arrived and set up camp in the south, sending a scout ahead to determine the strength and spirit of the Muslims. This scout would soon return with dire news. The Muslims had no ambushes set up, no reinforcements incoming, and were not making preparations to flee. He said to the leaders of his army, "These men have no defence or refuge but their swords." It was clear that Muhammad and his followers would fight to the death. To contrast the sense of doom and anxiety in the camp of the Quraysh, Muhammad worked through the day to raise the spirits of his own men, going about the site of the battlefield, declaring the spot where certain Meccans would die. The day of the battle began with the two armies lining up in front of each other, sizing up their opponents and preparing for the bloodshed to come. Significant rainfall overnight meant that the next morning, the sand of the wadi to the south where the water had flowed was thick and hard for the Quraysh to move through. Their cavalry would be useless on this terrain, and most of them dismounted, preparing to fight on foot. Muhammad organised his troops personally, using an arrow to ensure their ranks were straight and neat. With this arrow, he accidentally cut the stomach of Sawad bin Ghaziyah, one of his soldiers, who in turn demanded retaliation. Muhammad opened up his shirt, exposing his chest in order to receive a cut himself. However, Sawad kissed him on the stomach instead, declaring that when he died that day, he wanted that to be his final memory of his leader. This act exemplified the mood of the Muslim forces, who believed they would not survive the day, yet resolved to fight to the last. This feeling among the defenders was understandable, for soon the 1,000 Meccan soldiers, over half of whom were clad in sturdy chainmail armour, began their advance towards the Muslim lines. Before the battle came several duels between the champions of each army, as was customary in Arabic warfare. The first champion sent from the Meccan side was Al-Aswad bin Abdul Asad, who declared he would reach the Muslim well and drink from its waters, or die trying. Meeting him between the armies was Muhammad's uncle Hamza, who was chosen for his martial skill and his position among the Muslims. Hamza saw Al-Aswad's declaration to fruition by striking a devastating blow to his leg after a short struggle before finishing the man off. Next, the Meccans sent out Utbah ibn Rabi'ah with his brother Shayba and son Al-Walid. These men were clad in strong armour and carried stout shields. 3 Ansar answered their challenge, but were sent back, for the high-ranking Meccans demanded high-ranking Muhajirun to be their opponents. Thus, Hamza called Muhammad's cousins Ubaidah and Ali to join him in combat. The 6 men divided themselves into pairs, with Ubaidah facing off against Utbah, Hamza against Shayba, and Ali putting his martial prowess to the test against Al-Walid. The signal given, the 3 duels commenced at the same time. Hamza would finish off Shayba with his first strike, and Ali followed quickly afterwards, dealing a fatal blow to Al-Walid. However, Ubaidah quickly ran into trouble in his combat against the older and more experienced Utbah. Soon, Ubaidah was put on the back foot, and his leg was severed by a strike of Utbah's sword. Ali and Hamza rushed to help their comrade, and struck Utbah down before he could finish his foe off, carrying Ubaidah back to his tent for medical care. Despite their quick actions, their effort was in vain, as Ubaidah died soon afterwards, becoming the first Muslim to be martyred in battle. The duels were a triumph for the Muslims, but any joy they felt after their victory was soon dispelled as the Qurayshi army advanced, eager to prove themselves after their poor showing in the duels, and urged on by Ibn Hisham, who charged forward shouting, "O God, destroy those who cut the ties of kinship." The Muslim archers fired into the mass of soldiers from the left and right, while the infantry threw stones and javelins hoping to disrupt the charge. Many of these missiles found their mark, with Quraysh tumbling to the dust mid-stride. However, the volume of fire wasn't enough to deter the bulk of the enemy forces. As the Meccans drew closer, the Muslims drew their swords and readied their spears, resolving to weather the approaching storm that threatened to sweep them all away. The first assault was the strongest, the weight of the Meccan charge slamming into the Muslim lines, pushing their forces back. All the while, Muhammad stood at the front, exhorting his soldiers to fight with all their strength and wading into the thick of the battle himself, with his closest companions at his side. This first push would eventually falter, and both sides would pause to drink and regain their stamina. Here, though, Muhammad's plan to block the wells would begin working, for the Meccans were forced to ration their water usage, while the Muslims were free to drink as much as they pleased, leaving their soldiers much better off in the fighting to follow. The Meccans would try and push forward again and again, but each push would meet a wall of steel and zealous fury. Each attack gradually became weaker and weaker as their soldiers became more and more dehydrated, and the Muslims rotated their warriors in and out of battle to preserve their strength. Eventually, they could go no further, and their momentum was lost. Now, the ball was in the Muslim court, and Muhammad gathered up his troops for a great final struggle. He led the Muslims in a counterattack, charging into the Qurayshi lines. The Quran recounts here that 1,000 angels joined in this charge, their blades hacking through the Meccans just as the blades of the Muslims did. The Meccan army was thirsty, exhausted, and demoralized, and when Ibn Hisham's horse was brought down by the Muslims, who had been instructed to target the leaders of the enemy army, they broke and ran. Now, the true killing started. The Muslims ran down the Quraysh, whose heavy armour slowed their escape. Ibn Hisham himself was abandoned by both his troops and his own son, who fled when the Muslims neared their positions. He was finally found, injured, by Abdullah bin Masud, who cut off his head and presented it to Muhammad. Upon seeing the head, Muhammad turned to the son of Sumaya bint Hayat, the slave girl who Hisham had murdered in Medina many years before, and said, "God himself has struck down your mother's killer." The Battle of Badr was over. The Muslims had won against all odds, losing only 14 men for the 70 they killed and 40 they captured. Most of these prisoners were to be ransomed back to their families, while the few that were particularly opposed to the Muslims would be executed soon after victory was declared. After they'd recovered the spoils of war from the dead Meccans, the Muslims returned triumphant to Medina. Muhammad's position as their leader was solidified by his victory at Badr. He would go on to consolidate his power in Medina and grow his following there even further. On the other hand, the Quraysh initially refused to even fathom that they were defeated. Then, after the news had sunk in and the number of dead became clear, they became enraged. How could some upstart prophet inflict such a crushing defeat onto them? This was especially impactful because of the number of upper-rank Qurayshi nobles who were killed, Amr ibn Hisham the highest of all. The Muslims in a day had gone from an annoyance to a hated rival, and the Quraysh would be back to take their revenge. Badr was an incredible, unprecedented victory for the Muslims. However, the war between the two factions had only just begun, and its next stage would see fortune take a turn for the worse for Muhammad and his people. With the Muslim victory at Badr, Muhammad was in a much stronger position among the people of Medina. The population had gained much confidence in his cause and in his religion. Conversion to Islam spread even further in the following weeks and months, the fervour of the believers enticing more to join them. With the increase in size of the Islamic community, individual factions began to form. The largest of these were a group led by Abdullah ibn Ubay, the leader of the Khazraj tribe. His group of converts were only partially loyal to Islam and to Muhammad, often clashing with him in debates on policy, strategy, and religion. This group would become known in the Islamic tradition as the hypocrites, the munafiq, and they would gradually become bolder and bolder in their disobedience as time went on. After a number of violent incidents occurring between Jews and Muslims within the town of Medina, Muhammad accused one of Medina's 3 Jewish tribes, the Banu Qaynuqa, of violating the constitution of Medina and of working against the community. As a consequence, they were eventually banished from the city. Muhammad worked to soothe any further inflamed tensions with an additional non-aggression pact with the Banu Nadir. Not long after Badr, Abu Sufyan had led a raiding force of 200 men to Medina to gather information and plunder from the Muslims, as well as to show his resolve to avenge the Qurayshi losses in the previous battle. This raid ended in failure, the Meccans even dumping their provisions to lighten their load so they could escape the chasing Muslims, leading to the name the Raid of the Barley Gruel. Nonetheless, the raid had sent a message that the war was not over, and the Meccans would soon come back, bloodied, but not out of the fight. Throughout the rest of the year, the Muslims continued raiding Qurayshi caravans, successfully intercepting one on its way to modern-day Iraq. Seeing that their trading empire was quickly crumbling underneath them, the nobles of Mecca pushed forward their plans to launch an attack on Medina. In the autumn of 624 AD, only a few months after the events of Badr, the various merchants of Mecca came together under the leadership of Abu Sufyan. They pooled all their profits from their recent successful caravans and used this combined fund to raise a large army of both Qurayshi warriors and mercenaries from across the land, as far away as Ethiopia. Their new army was 3,000 men strong, with 700 of these wearing sturdy chainmail and 200 on horseback. The logistics for such a large army at the time were difficult to manage, and one tribe would struggle to transport enough food for a drawn-out siege. Muhammad was aware of this fact, and planned to hole up behind the walls of Medina to either defend the city or wait out the Meccans. However, in speaking to his people before the battle, he found that many of the younger Muslims who weren't at Badr wished to fight Abu Sufyan's army face to face on the field. They wanted a chance to win glory for themselves in open combat, rather than face the burden of a siege. Eventually, Muhammad relented to the request of his young soldiers, and, despite the urging of his closest companions, as well as Abdullah ibn Ubay, the leader of the hypocrite faction, he donned his armour in preparation for a battle outside the city. Seeing that they'd pressured their prophet into changing his course of action, the young Muslims begged him to reconsider, but he would refuse, saying, "When a prophet puts on his military dress, it does not behoove him to take it off before God decides between him and his enemies." Now determined to face his enemies out in the open, Muhammad gathered his army of 1,000 men. Of this number, only 100 were armoured, and only 4 were mounted, meaning the Muslims would again be at a disadvantage in terms of both equipment and mobility. Abu Sufyan's army approached Medina from the northwest via Badr, so as to avoid the many fortified homes and compounds on the other approaches to the city, and to avoid trespassing on the land of any neutral tribes and see them ally with the Muslims. Muhammad took his army eastwards, looping around to the north towards the slopes of Mount Uhud, where the next great battle of his military career would take place. As Muhammad's force neared the base of the mountain, almost at the spot they had chosen to fight the battle, a great commotion suddenly sounded from the rear of his column. Without warning, Abdullah ibn Ubay, the hypocrite leader, had turned his troops and those of his allies around and began marching them back to Medina, abandoning Muhammad and the rest of the Muslims. These 300 troops would instead follow Ibn Ubay's plan and prepare Medina for a siege, fortifying the town against attack, but significantly dividing the Muslim forces in the process. With this unexpected desertion, the balance of power was tipped even further away from the Muslims, and their odds of victory became all the more slim. Even so, the remaining soldiers continued onwards towards the battlefield. ready to fight overwhelming odds for their faith and their leader. Now 300 men short, Muhammad and his army set up camp in a defile in the southern foot of the mountain, preparing their supplies and weapons for the battle to come. Abu Sufyan's army arrived from the west later that day, encamping on the dry, open expanse to the southwest of the mountain. The night before the battle, a tension hung in the air, both sleepless armies knowing of the bloodshed that was sure to follow when the sun rose. At dawn, Muhammad and his commanders roused their troops, shouting words of encouragement and giving precise orders so that each man knew his place in the battle to come. The Muslims' main infantry force would array themselves in the gap between the mountains and a small hillock known as Hunayn, facing the Qurayshi forces to the southwest, with the steep mountain slopes to their back, in case they needed to flee. They would be arranged in two ranks, with the light infantry at the front, who were to skirmish with the enemy as they closed in. Those with armour would stand behind them, ready to fill in any gaps in the line or exploit any advantages they see. The right flank of the infantry would be protected by the steep slopes of Mount Uhud, while the left flank would be guarded by a small contingent of 50 archers placed at the top of the hill. To the archers at the top of Hunayn, Muhammad gave his most specific orders. They were not to leave their post under any circumstances. Whether they were routing their enemies or being destroyed themselves, the archers were to stay put. This was because of the danger of the Qurayshi cavalry, who could easily outflank the Muslims by riding along the plain between Hunayn and the deep Wadi Kanat to the south. The archers were to harass any cavalry force moving through the area and force them to turn back the way they came, ensuring that any threat to the infantry came from the front, where they could resist it effectively. Abu Sufyan mirrored Muhammad's positioning, placing his infantry parallel to the Muslims, with archers behind. He then divided his cavalry into two sections, each guarding one of his flanks. The left section he placed under the command of Ikrimah ibn Amr, the son of Muhammad's slain enemy, Amr ibn Hisham, who was eager to avenge his father's death. The right section of the cavalry, Abu Sufyan placed under the leadership of a Meccan noble named Khalid ibn al-Walid. This man would, though none knew it at the time, eventually be revered as one of the greatest generals in human history and be granted the title the Sword of God for his work leading the armies of Islam across the known world. This day, however, the Sword of God was yet to embrace the new religion and was pointed squarely at the chest of its prophet. The battle began with a series of small skirmishes, Qurayshi and Muslim archers shouting taunts and loosing arrows and stones at each other. This was repeated several times to little effect, until the Qurayshi standard-bearer, Talha ibn Abi Talha, announced a challenge for single combat. The ever-loyal Ali would be the man to answer this call, rushing to meet his foe and cracking his skull with his first strike. Now, seeing his kin struck down, the brother of Talha, Uthman, stepped forward, only to be met by Hamza, Muhammad's uncle, who dealt with him just as quickly as Ali did with his brother. Following their failure in the duels, Abu Sufyan ordered his troops forward, and the Muslims, with a renewed spirit, charged forward to meet them. The two forces clashed in a furious melee, with stories of great bravery coming from both sides. The rear rank of the Muslims would quickly join in the fighting, shoring up any holes in the line or helping push the Quraysh back. Khalid and his detachment of cavalry attempted to outflank the Muslim army, just as Muhammad had anticipated, but were pushed back by a hail of arrows from the group of archers on the hill. They would retreat to their positions behind the Meccan lines and remain largely unengaged for the majority of combat in this first phase of the battle. The fighting was fierce, but the determination and fury of the Muslims saw them push their enemies to the breaking point. At the centre of the fight was the captured Qurayshi standard that was brought there by the slain Talha. One by one, Talha's brothers and sons would try and retake their banner, and one by one they would be cut down, some by arrows, some by the nearby Muslims, the rest by Hamza, whose blade would end the day stained red from a dozen different sources. It was only thanks to the efforts of a lone Qurayshi woman, one of the many who followed their army to boost morale, but the standard was regained and Abu Sufyan's force was spared from a complete rout. As victory appeared certain, the Muslim archers on the hill eyed the field before them gleefully, watching as the infantry looted the armour and valuables of the slain Meccans. Seeing the spoils free for the taking, and assured that the battle was already won, many of these archers began to descend towards the melee, with only a small minority remaining true to their promise to Muhammad not to leave the hill no matter what. Seeing an opening, Khalid rallied together all 200 of the Meccan cavalry and brought them around to the right flank of their forces, possibly passing through the wadi to reduce their visibility. The remaining archers on the hill were so preoccupied with recovering their comrades that they took no notice of Khalid's movements. They realised their mistake far too late, for by the time the alarm was sounded, the Meccan horsemen were almost on top of them. Within seconds, the line of horsemen had swept through the archers, butchering them to a man. The left flank of the Muslim army was now totally undefended, and Khalid exploited this opportunity to the fullest. Losing almost no momentum, the Meccan horsemen plunged back down the hill towards the Muslim infantry, a wall of steel and frothing flesh slamming into the rear ranks like an avalanche. At the same time, in the thickest point of the fighting between the infantry, Muhammad's uncle Hamza was slain by an Ethiopian slave soldier, his body pierced through by one of the man's javelins. The cavalry assault, combined with the death of one of their greatest fighters, and a rumour that Muhammad himself had been killed, led to a full-scale rout by the Muslim forces, the soldiers scrambling up the mountain slopes to escape the slaughter beneath, with the enemy nipping at their heels only a few paces behind. Muhammad had not been killed in the fighting, only injured, either by a thrown stone or a blow by a battle axe, which knocked out some of his teeth. Unfortunately, this became known to his army far too late for them to regroup, and all he could do was retreat up the mountain slope with the rest of his men. Thankfully for Muhammad and his scattered army, the Qurayshi infantry didn't pursue the Muslims any further up the mountain. They were content to gather the spoils left behind on the battlefield and to face the bodies of the dead Muslims left on the plain, with the wife of Abu Sufyan supposedly cutting out Hamza's liver. Even so, the day was well and truly lost. The Muslim forces were scattered, disorganized, and disunified, fleeing for safety up the steep ridges of Mount Uhud. The confidence built up from their previous victories had been shattered, and it would take a long time for any semblance of control to return to that force. It's not fully understood why the Meccans refused to press their victory after the Battle of Uhud. Some scholars suggest that it was because they didn't want to fight Abdullah ibn Ubay, who'd fortified the city with his 300 deserters. Some think they didn't want to reforge the unity of the Medinans after Muhammad's defeat had shaken their confidence in him. Either way, the Meccan army decided to withdraw from the field and march back home, keeping a sizable rearguard force in case they were harassed from behind. Slowly, the routed Muslim army reconstituted itself, and the soldiers limped their way back home with their tails between their legs. They knew that only luck and the unwillingness of the Quraysh to press their attack had saved them that day. Even so, they'd lost 75 of their greatest fighters, and many more had ended the day wounded, battered and bruised, while Abu Sufyan's force had lost at most 35 of their original 3,000. Muhammad's position as their leader was not put into question quite as harshly as Abu Sufyan had expected, for his troops understood that their defeat was a result of the greed of the archers, and they reasoned that their loss was a punishment from God for disobedience towards their prophet. Similarly, Abdullah ibn Ubay saw surprisingly few consequences for his desertion, possibly because Muhammad wished to avoid any further strife within the Islamic community and sympathized with Abdullah's desire to defend his city. This would prove a prudent decision, for rocking the boat at this time would only serve to make the coming storm all the more dangerous. Muhammad spent the next 6 months after his defeat at Uhud lying low and reorganizing Medina and his army. At some point during this period, an assassination attempt on his life was foiled, and its roots traced back to the leaders of the Banu Nadir, one of the 2 Jewish tribes remaining in the city. After a short and relatively bloodless siege of their residences, They were expelled from Medina and relocated to Syria or to the nearby oasis town of Khaybar, being allowed to take with them what possessions one family could carry on a single camel. The Banu Nadir may have left Medina without significant bloodshed, but they would not forget this banishment so easily, and they would henceforth work to see their revenge against those who banished them fulfilled. At this point, the Muslim position was extremely tenuous. The tide of war had turned against them, and many previously neutral neighbouring tribes began openly siding with Mecca, raiding and killing any Muslims who attempted to proselytize them. The Meccans tried to launch another attack on Medina in the October of 625, sending 2,000 men north on the road towards Badr. In a stroke of good luck for the Muslims, the harsh summer of that year had removed much of the foliage on the way there, so the Meccans were unable to forage for the supplies they needed to sustain themselves over a long siege. Without the logistical requirements of their operations met, they returned back to Mecca, vowing to return again when the opportunity arose. Muhammad knew his people needed a victory after their humiliating defeat at Uhud, so he began looking for targets to raid. Hearing of a possible threat to the northeast, he took a small force up to Dumat al-Jandal, where rumour said a hostile tribe was organising a raid on Medina. While the Muslims never found any enemies, they managed to plunder enough livestock that the raid was considered a success. Similar raids would be conducted throughout the next year, originally with the intent to seize property and sustain the population of Medina, but increasingly as a form of deterrence. Muhammad was trying to reassure the outlying tribes of the power of the Muslims and dissuade them from joining any alliance against their interests. It was a good thing that Muhammad had carried out these raids to boost the morale of his people, because Abu Sufyan was preparing for them their greatest ordeal yet. With the financial support of the banished Banu Nadir and the merchant nobles of Mecca, he'd gathered another army, using all the wealth and political influence of the Quraysh to form a coalition of nomadic tribes. This campaign would have one terrible overarching purpose: lay waste to Medina, kill Muhammad and his companions, and destroy Islam once and for all. The Meccan army was formed primarily of three main units. The first was the Quraysh force, numbering about 5,200 men with 300 horsemen. Next was the force of the Banu Ghatafan, about 2,000 soldiers and 200 horsemen. And finally, a third force made up of minor tribes led by the Banu Sulaym. This contingent numbered around 2,500 men in all, with 100 horsemen. The Qurayshi troops and the group led by the Banu Sulaym marched north from Mecca towards Medina, while the Banu Ghatafan came from their home in the east. In total, the massive Meccan army numbered around 10,000 troops, with 600 on horseback. This was almost equal to the entire population of Medina at the time of the Hijrah, and even though the city had grown substantially since, there was still no chance they could match the might of such a legion head-to-head. Another tribe from the area of Mecca, the Banu Khuzar, who were secretly allies of Muhammad, sent their fastest riders ahead of the Meccans to alert Medina of the horde that would soon be at their gates. These horsemen arrived 4 days later, and warned Muhammad that the enemies would arrive in but a week's time. Muhammad gathered his people in the centre of Medina for a general council of war, where they would determine what strategy they would employ to fend off the coalition. They eventually decided to wait out the Meccans in a siege, understanding that they couldn't afford another costly field battle, and hoping that supply shortages would weaken their enemies once they had stripped the land bare. The city of Medina was built in a favourable geographical position to withstand the siege. The west of the oasis was protected by its mountainous terrain, while the east and south were guarded by large, difficult-to-traverse lava fields, as well as thick groves of trees. Its only weak point lay to the north, which was flat and vulnerable to cavalry assaults. Any other Arabic force would have been unable to guard against such an attack. However, through the spread of Islam, Muhammad had attracted to his banner many misfits from faraway lands, who were experienced in many tactics and forms of warfare not previously practiced by the Arabs. One of these men is known to history as Salman the Persian, and he suggested the people of Medina dig a great trench and set of earthworks, stretching across the whole exposed northern side of the city. This would serve to break the momentum of any cavalry assault, as well as offering an obstacle to any attacking foot soldiers and protection from archers. This was the first time that such a strategy is known to have been utilized in Arabic warfare, and the Muslims hoped that the use of a novel tactic such as this, which the Quraysh would have no answer to, would help offset their extreme numerical disadvantage. Muhammad put the whole city to work digging this trench, even jumping in pick in hand to contribute himself. He also ordered the population to harvest their crops early, so the Meccans would have to supply themselves and couldn't live off the land. These instructions given, he set up his command tent at the top of a hill to the north of the city, where he would have a good view of the entire fortification and could direct troops effectively to where they were most needed. Women and children were moved into the innermost reaches of the city, while all men above the age of 14 were given weapons and prepared for combat, giving Muhammad an army around 3,000 men strong, with 300 of them on horseback. The Banu Qurayza, located in the southeast of the city, were not obliged to join Muhammad's forces, as the Jewish tribe had no obligations to help in the Muslims' war. However, they had declared to the Muslims that they would stay neutral in the conflict, as long as they remained unharmed by either party. Within only a week, the trench had been completed, 8 feet deep, stretching for 3.5 kilometers end to end, with a high embankment raised behind it from the upturned dirt. This would serve as a formidable deterrent to the forces of the coalition, and would, if all went to plan, help the Muslims weather the siege and protect their city. At last, the dreaded day had come. The forces from Mecca and from the Banu Ghatafan converged to the north of the city. The heaving mass of troops, tents, camels, and horses stretched across the whole expanse of the desert plain. Muhammad's men manned their positions behind the embankment, unsure how they could ever hold off such a host, but willing to give their lives attempting to do so. The battle began immediately with a probing attack on the city. The Meccan cavalry charged in with the goal of testing the spirit of the defenders and trying to open up a hole in the Muslim lines. But they were unprepared to deal with the deep trench and determination of the defenders. After a short struggle, the horsemen were quickly driven back. With the first assault proving a failure, the Meccans settled in for a siege, having brought enough provisions to last a while outside the city without having to resupply. For 2 long weeks the armies would line up, exchange insults and arrows, and withdraw at the end of the day. Eventually, a group of Qurayshi soldiers led by the young firebrands Amr ibn Abd Wud and Ikrimah ibn Amr grew restless and tired of their lack of momentum and meagre rations. These soldiers decided to break ranks and attack a section of the Muslim lines unexpectedly. They quickly managed to overpower the defenders of that section and establish a crossing point over the trench, eventually reaching the foot of the hill that Muhammad had placed his camp on. Here, Amr issued a challenge to the Muslims on the hill to face him in single combat, and Ali, always willing to prove his devotion to his faith, accepted. Both of these fighters were incredibly skilled, and the duel went on for a long time, the struggle kicking up so much dust and sand that the spectators lost sight of the 2 combatants. Finally, from the direction of the fighters, a sharp scream sounded and was suddenly cut short. The audience held their breath, not knowing who would emerge from the duel victorious, until from the cloud of dust came the chant, "Allahu Akbar, God is the greatest." Ali had defeated his foe, and in doing so, demoralized the Meccans, who retreated back over the trench, abandoning the bridgehead they had established. That following night would see several more attempts to cross the trench from other small strike groups. Though now the element of surprise was gone, each one was quickly thrown back, either by the blades of the Muslims or the stones they had piled on the embankment to throw at their enemies. The Meccans had realized that no individual contingent was sufficient to bring about the victory they desired. They would need to bring to bear the full bulk of their great army to break the defenders of the trench. Thus, when the sun came up, a full, large-scale attack was prepared. As the plans had almost been finalized, the more cautious commanders in the army went to meet with Abu Sufyan. The Meccans remembered how they were thrown back at Badr and Uhud, and wanted another front opened up before it was launched. Abu Sufyan agreed with this and set loose his final trump card. Huyay ibn Akhtab, the leader of the exiled Banu Nadir who had accompanied the coalition, slipped past the trench into Medina and organised a meeting with the Banu Qurayza, the last major Jewish tribe within the city. The Qurayza had so far stayed neutral, even providing shovels, picks and baskets to help the Muslims finish the digging of their trench. However, looking at the size of the Meccan army, seeing the weariness in the face of Muhammad and his followers, and with Huyay's honeyed words in their ears, they decided it was time to openly declare their oath of neutrality void and begin gathering their forces. Hearing of this betrayal, Muhammad sent his 300 cavalry, who were ineffective in trench warfare, and 100 of his foot soldiers to the inner city. He hoped these troops would deter the Qurayza and offer some defense to the women and children sheltering there. Muhammad had hoped that knowledge of the Qurayza's new allegiance could be kept from his soldiers fighting on the front line with the Meccans. However, here he was mistaken. The rumour spread like a wildfire among the Muslim ranks, and fear filled their hearts that their cause was truly lost. With the Muslim rear compromised and a portion of their army drawn away from the front lines, the Meccans knew that their foes could no longer defend the entirety of their fortifications. They gathered their forces under the command of Khalid ibn al-Walid for a final, crushing attack, which would break the lines of their enemy, leave their city defenseless, and destroy forever the upstart religion they had come to despise. Muhammad knew his troops were exhausted and finally admitted that the fight couldn't be won by force of arms alone. He contacted the Banu Ghatafan, offering them a third of the Medinan harvest if they withdrew. The Ghatafan entertained these promises. However, once the people of Medina heard of these terms, they ran to their leader and convinced him to cancel the offer, stating that it would dishonour the people of the city. Though this negotiation brought no concrete benefits to the Muslims, the other members of the Meccan coalition, who had also learned of these dealings, began to eye each other with suspicion. At the same time, Muhammad met privately with Nu'aym bin Mas'ud, a key leader in the Confederacy, who was secretly a Muslim convert and an agent of Muhammad. Nu'aym was ordered to sow discord behind enemy lines, a command that he would execute masterfully. He first went to the Banu Qurayza and informed them that the Confederacy would not protect them from Muhammad if the siege failed, and that they should take hostages from the Confederates to ensure their loyalty. Once this was done, he went to Abu Sufyan and warned him that the Qurayza had secretly defected again to the side of Muhammad and would demand hostages from them, only to turn them over to the Muslims to be used as bargaining chips. Nu'aym's strategy of disinformation worked marvellously, and both sides acted on his advice immediately. Once the Qurayza message demanding hostages was received by the Meccans, as Nu'aym had stated it would be, Abu Sufyan denounced both them and the Banu Nadir who were working with them as traitors. In a fit of rage, he would expel Huyay ibn Akhtab from his army, sending him back to the Nadir fortress of Khaybar, fearing for his life, and ending their partnership for good. Learning of this disavowal, the leadership of the Banu Qurayza was paralysed with indecisiveness, and with no orders to act on, their warriors gradually dispersed back to their homes, no longer posing any threat to Medina. The tables had now turned against the Meccans. With an attack from the rear averted, they were unwilling to send the bulk of their army into the meat grinder that was the trench, and they returned to their camp disheartened and dissatisfied. The other tribes the Quraysh had brought into their coalition with the prospect of loot and glory now saw victory slipping from their grasp. They had lost faith in their leaders and in each other, and as inter-tribe rivalries began to flare, disorder ran rampant through their camp. As the nights grew colder, unnaturally so for the region, the wind began to howl, blowing sand and dust into the faces of the Meccans and extinguishing their fires, while leaving the Muslims unscathed who were shielded by their hill. These portents of doom, along with the growing enmity within the Meccan ranks and their continued failure to pierce the Muslim lines, led the Confederacy to collapse from within. Their armies collectively withdrew from Medina 27 days after they had arrived, each tribe heading their separate ways, leaving Khalid to head a Qurayshi rearguard to prevent pursuit. Khalid's rearguard would ultimately prove to be pointless, but the attention of the Muslims was not on the fleeing coalition forces, but on the Banu Qurayza, who had forsaken their vows, and in doing so, almost brought about the ruin of the army, the city, and Islam itself. In his previous battles and skirmishes, Muhammad had typically been uncommonly merciful to his enemies, ransoming his prisoners rather than executing them whenever possible, and offering them freedom if they were willing to convert. This day, however, there was no more mercy for him to give. For 25 days the Qurayza were besieged, the Muslims content to starve them out of their homes rather than spill unnecessary blood fighting. Eventually, the tribe's supply of food and water ran out, and they could last no longer. Their sentence for their betrayal was determined by the leader of their former ally, the Banu Aus, who now held them in the same contempt as the rest of the Muslims of Medina. The women and children of the tribe were taken and sold into slavery, while the men, totaling between 600 and 800, were beheaded, 10 at a time, their heads buried in the central market of Medina. This bloody event concluded the most perilous battle of Islam. The Battle of the Trench was a clear, decisive victory for the Muslims. With the nature of the fighting behind defensive earthworks, the ratio of casualties between them and the coalition was incredibly high. However, since no full-scale battle took place, and neither side was routed, the number of casualties was significantly lower than previous battles. Numbers differ between sources, but every account states that only a tiny portion of the Muslim army was killed, possibly as few as 4 or 5, while the Meccans suffered significantly heavier losses, losing between 10 and 20 men, and sustaining hundreds of injuries from arrows and stones. The destruction of the Banu Qurayza served not only as retribution for their betrayal, but as a warning to all those who might think of opposing Medina in the future, that those who stood in the path of the rising storm would be swept aside. With this tactic, Muhammad hoped to rein in any opposition left in the Hejaz region, and push the pagans of Arabia, who could sense which way the wind was blowing, into joining his cause. On the other hand, the Quraysh had suffered a humiliating defeat. They prided themselves in their ability to build coalitions and influence the Arab tribes, but when it mattered the most, they were unable to bring their alliance victory. Their failure brought great discomfort to the tribes associated with them, who began to believe that the Quraysh could no longer be counted on to provide them protection. The Battle of the Trench marked the greatest extent of Qurayshi power in their war against the Muslims. From here onwards, they would find themselves overshadowed by the growing prominence of Muhammad and of Islam. The victory at the Battle of the Trench had now completely solidified Muhammad's position as the undisputed leader of the city. The hypocrite faction was effectively disbanded, as its members, including Abdullah ibn Ubay, now began to trust and believe in Muhammad. Furthermore, the remaining pagan Arab and Jewish tribes in the city were too small to be of any threat to the Muslims, who now made up the vast majority of Medina's population. After the battle, Muhammad would grant his people a short respite from fighting. They'd endured a month-long siege and couldn't be expected to march out on campaign without time to rest and heal their wounds. During this downtime, the Muslims worked to increase the effectiveness of their military by increasing the size of their cavalry contingent. From this point until the campaigning began again, their number of soldiers mounted on horses would increase sixfold. The Muslims now had a mounted force equal in size, though maybe not yet of quality, to the Quraysh. This mounted force would soon prove useful, as Muhammad used them to raid several of the nearby tribes, no longer waiting for rumours of treachery or deceit, but making deliberate shows of force to suppress any potential threats. Additionally, if any tribe were to attack a member of the Islamic community, the Muslims would now begin to respond punitively, sending expeditions to punish the aggressors rather than simply avoiding the hostile group, as was the policy previously. With the increasing frequency of the raiding, Medina's surrounding tribes began to acknowledge the shifting balance of power and convert to Islam en masse, swelling the Muslims' numbers and support. Muhammad believed that he now had the strength to demand respect, recognition and caution from the Quraysh. who had put this to the test by delving straight into the lion's den and embarking on a traditional pilgrimage to Mecca, known as an Umrah. Such pilgrimages to the holy city were a common custom for Arabs even before the time of Islam, and with the years of conflict and tension between the Muslims and the Quraysh, many of Muhammad's followers had also gone several years without undertaking one. Knowing of this longing to fulfill their spiritual needs, Muhammad extended an invitation to all Muslims, both from Medina and from the outlying tribes, to join him on his pilgrimage. Eventually, once the 1,400 pilgrims who wished to complete the Umrah had all gathered, they set off from Medina. Unfortunately for the Muslims, the Quraysh did not trust Muhammad's assurance of their peaceful intent, and sent a force of 500 men led by Ikrimah ibn Amr to block their path, as well as 200 cavalry led by Khalid ibn al-Walid to act as mobile reinforcements if fighting were to break out. Muhammad's attempts to bypass this force failed, and, unable to press on any further without coming into conflict, he set up camp at the well of al-Hudaybiyah, 5 miles east of Mecca, where the sacred boundary surrounding the city ended. Here, he and the leaders of the Quraysh exchanged messages for some time, each side trying to judge the intentions of the other, the Muslims wishing to complete their pilgrimage, and the Quraysh fearing the presence of so many enemies within their borders. Following a tense period of negotiations, Ali ibn Abi Talib was chosen to put together the final draft of a treaty between the two parties. Over time, this treaty had gotten broader and broader in its scope, and now aimed to end the conflict between the Muslims and the Quraysh entirely. Within this treaty were 6 main stipulations. Firstly, the Muslims and the Quraysh were to sign a 10-year truce, halting all hostilities between the two sides. Next, that neither side could engage in any subterfuge, raiding, or hidden activities meant to damage the other. Sections 3 and 4 concerned defections to either side. If someone from Mecca were to join Islam and flee to Muhammad, they were to be sent back. However, if a Muslim were to renounce their faith and join the Quraysh, they would be allowed to do so. The Muslims and the Quraysh were permitted to develop any alliances they wished, with their allies being placed under the protection of the treaty as well. Finally, regarding the Muslims' pilgrimage, they would agree to withdraw for the time being and come back to complete it next year. This Treaty of Hudaybiyah, while it was originally lambasted by Muhammad's allies as an admittance of defeat to the Quraysh, was in truth a masterstroke of diplomacy. In one move, Muhammad had removed any remaining threat of another Meccan coalition, as had been seen during the Battle of the Trench, and cemented the Muslims as a recognised equal to the Quraysh. This peace treaty was a signal to the Muslims across the land who had concealed their conversion for fear of persecution, to declare their faith openly, and to spread their religion far and wide. What followed was a surge in the number of converts around the Hejaz region, with none more important than Khalid ibn al-Walid himself, who renounced his loyalty to the Quraysh and would, in time, become one of Muhammad's most trusted generals. The freedom this treaty in early 628 AD gave the Muslims from the looming sword of the Quraysh was quickly exploited. Muhammad took this opportunity to strike out at the remaining tribes who refused to side with either him or Mecca. The sweetest of these conquests was gained at the fortified oasis town of Khaybar, where the Banu Nadir, the Jewish tribe who had been expelled from Mecca years ago and proved themselves so eager to return the favour during the Battle of the Trench, had made their homes. Muhammad marched north to Khaybar with 1,500 soldiers, laying siege to the many fortified compounds of the town before its inhabitants eventually surrendered. As was seen with many of Muhammad's other conquests, he showed a greater degree of tolerance towards his defeated enemies than was usual for the time, choosing to spare the people of Khaybar rather than kill or enslave them, providing they paid tribute to Medina, thus setting the precedent of the jizya tax for Islamic conquerors throughout history. With Khaybar humbled, the Quraysh pacified, and his movement growing, Muhammad was content to sit back and let events take their course. The rest of 628 and the first half of 629 saw little action other than a few scattered raids and a poorly executed skirmish with the Byzantine army and their Arab allies in the north. The Muslims even managed to complete their Umrah to Mecca 1 year after the signing of the treaty, an event that lifted the spirits of many pilgrims, some of whom hadn't journeyed to the Kaaba since before the Hijrah, 7 years previously. Alas, this peace was not to last, for fate had a different plan for Arabia. In an attempt to take revenge for the previous killing of one of their members before the signing of the treaty, the Banu Bakr, an ally of the Quraysh, launched a surprise attack on one of the wells controlled by the Banu Khuzar, an ally of the Muslims. The raid led to the killing of some of the Khuzar and the wounding of many more. Historians think that it's likely that several hot-headed Quraysh also participated in this raid, broadening the scale of the minor conflict significantly. After the raid, Abu Sufyan travelled north to Medina, attempting to negotiate with Muhammad to resolve the conflict without any further escalation, but he was either unwilling or unable to accept any of the terms Muhammad offered. The attitude of the Muslims to the Meccans was cold at this time, as they saw them as oath-breakers who reneged on their treaty obligations, and Abu Sufyan was forced to leave the city in defeat, finding no allies to back his cause. With the breaking of the Treaty of Hudaybiyah in late 629 AD, the conflict between Medina and Mecca was reignited. However, it would be incorrect to view this as a smooth continuation of the previous conflict, for circumstances had changed drastically over the past 2 years. The Quraysh were struggling immensely economically from their lost caravans and from boycotts from Muslim-aligned tribes, whereas the Muslims had increased their power exponentially, attracting vast numbers of converts from all over Arabia and forging alliances or non-aggression treaties with many prominent groups around the Hejaz. Muhammad was aware of how the scales had tipped so dramatically in his favour and resolved to end this war as soon as possible in one fell swoop. He sent out a call to all of his allies, his companions and his followers to rush to Medina. 10,000 men in total, bringing their arms and armour for a final confrontation with the Meccans. So fast were his preparations that he left before many of his warriors had even arrived at Medina, having instead to hurry after the main force in hopes of catching up on the way to Mecca. Muhammad also leveraged another of his great advantages in this moment, his network of spies within Mecca, who worked to deceive its leadership about the true location and intention of the Muslim force. By the time the Meccans were fully aware of the Muslim army bearing down on them, it was too late for them to mount any effective resistance. The skill of the Quraysh at building coalitions mattered little when the enemy was already at their door. Muhammad's lightning strike had its desired effect, and the Qurayshi resistance crumbled before they even caught sight of a single soldier. The night before the Muslims arrived in Mecca, Abu Sufyan met once again with the Prophet. Here, finally, he prostrated himself, surrendering himself and his people to Muhammad, and uttering for the first time, "There is no God but Allah," converting to Islam. The Meccans had now lost their last great leader, and the end was truly upon them. The next day, Muhammad allowed Abu Sufyan to go free, commanding him to go to Mecca and deliver its citizens a message. The Muslims would not seek revenge on the people of Mecca, nor would they despoil the city. With only a few exceptions, all those who fled to the Kaaba, stayed with Abu Sufyan, or locked themselves in their homes would have their safety guaranteed. This proclamation came as a great surprise to the Meccans, who expected to be slaughtered to a man, as was typical of conquerors of the time. However, Muhammad had no desire to create a bloodbath here, since he still viewed the Quraysh as his people, and wished more than anything to lead them rather than destroy them. Once Abu Sufyan had set off with the message, Muhammad divided his force into 4 contingents. Each column would advance on the city from one of its 4 entry points. The main column, led by Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah, would take the Medina road, entering Mecca through the northwest. Another would head southwest, led by Muhammad's cousin, Zubayr ibn al-Awam. From the south, Ali would enter with the light infantry, while Khalid would bring the cavalry around to the northeast. In this way, the city was surrounded, and all exit points were sealed. With this strategy, any coordinated resistance the Muslims might face during their push would have to be dispersed between the 4 columns, and only one group would have to succeed in its objectives for the city to fall. The taking of the city came as quite an anticlimax when compared to the war that preceded it, and to what the Muslims feared they would face. The columns of Abu Ubaidah, Zubayr, and Ali entered and occupied the city centre with no resistance at all, while only Khalid's forces saw any conflict. A small skirmish had broken out with the remnants of those who still resisted Muhammad, led by Ikrimah ibn Amr. This was only temporary, however, as it was quickly crushed by a charge of the Muslim cavalry. Khalid then joined back up with the rest of the army, and victory was declared. Compared to the importance and the scale of the victory that had been won, the conquest of Mecca was a relatively bloodless affair. Only 2 Muslims had died during Khalid's skirmish, and just 12 of the defenders. 10 more Meccans were scheduled to be killed after the battle, those that had most vigorously campaigned against Islam for the last decade. However, of these, only 3 were executed. The rest, including Ikrimah ibn Amr himself, being granted clemency after converting and begging the forgiveness of Muhammad. Once these executions were completed, and the chaos of his conquest had settled down, Muhammad moved to accomplish the task he had worked towards for so many years. He entered the open plaza where the Kaaba sat, and smashed the 300 idols that shared its space, scattering their shards across the ground and famously declaring, "Truth has come, and falsehood perished, for by its nature, falsehood is ever bound to perish." Muhammad worked quickly to consolidate his control of the city, centralizing many of its key administrative duties and privileges among his subordinates, and granting himself the right to feed and water pilgrims. These rights, and the new systems of taxation he introduced, gave his followers control over both the financial and religious aspects of Meccan life, ensuring a smooth transition of power to the new Muslim rulers. At this time, many Meccans were convinced to embrace Islam, and the wounds that had been done to their society over the last decade slowly began to heal. Muhammad also worked quickly to bring into his fold the smaller tribes around Mecca, sending small parties to their territory to accept their conversions and break their idols, just as Muhammad had done in Mecca. Muhammad had finally claimed his greatest prize, and as far as he knew, his troubles were over. However, he would soon find that the greatest difficulty would come not from taking Mecca, but from keeping it. With Mecca and the Quraysh absorbed into the Islamic community, Muhammad was confident that his days as a general were at an end, and he could finally devote his time to spiritual matters. Unfortunately, this was not to be just yet, for as Muhammad was gathering his army in Medina, and word was being sent to all his allied tribes, the message had spread further than he had intended. The Quraysh were not the only major Arabic tribe who felt threatened by Muhammad's new community. The Banu Hawazin and the Banu Thaqif, along with numerous smaller tribes, had formed a secret coalition spanning the length and breadth of the peninsula to strike out at the Muslims. Mustering the full might of Arabia, their army numbered 20,000 strong, kicking up great plumes of dust and sand in their wake. The coalition's original plan was to attack the Muslim forces from the rear during their siege. Thus, they'd begun their march just as Muhammad's army was nearing Mecca. However, since the city fell in such a short period of time, carrying out this surprise attack was no longer possible. Any battle between the two sides would instead have to be fought fair and square, either on the open field or house to house in the city. The intelligence network of the anti-Muslim alliance was extremely effective, and the Muslims had no knowledge of the oncoming horde until only a few days before their arrival. Upon learning of the mass of soldiers that would soon sweep over them, the Muslims fell into a panic, not knowing whether they should retreat and give up their long-desired conquest, or whether they should face the approaching foe. Muhammad, however, acted decisively. He knew that a siege would be too risky, for Mecca was a barren and infertile land, and they had little food to last 10,000 hungry soldiers for the months a siege may take. The only option was to meet the enemy head-on, and hope their courage proved enough to turn the tide. Mustering his 10,000 soldiers, and adding to their ranks another 2,000 from the new converts of Mecca, Muhammad marched out to meet the great coalition head to head. The Muslims marched northeast through the dry bed of the Hunayn Wadi, eventually making camp for the night in the trough of the valley, a short distance away from the base of their enemies. Muhammad had sent spies to gather information on the size of the enemy forces and the details of their plans, and upon hearing of the scale of the foe they would be facing, the Muslims despaired, even accusing the spy of lying for a time. No army of such a size had been seen in Arabia for generations, and the Muslims trembled at the thought of such a mass of enemies bearing down upon them. The fight ahead was set to be the most difficult of their lives. As the sun rose the day of the battle, Muhammad arrayed his forces across the valley, handing out standards, flags, and banners to his commanders. He then ordered his men to advance and approach the coalition's position in a column, travelling through the dried bed of the wadi. The Muslim army marched forward for some time, unaware that to their left and right, enemy soldiers had concealed themselves in the cracks and crevices of the wadi's slopes and in the secondary channels of the dried riverbed, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. As the front of the column reached a predetermined position, a shout reverberated across the valley. The hidden enemies revealed themselves, hurling stones and firing arrows towards the Muslims. At the same time, the bulk of the coalition army emerged from a position past the bend in the wadi, charging forward towards the front of the column and shouting with all the strength their lungs could muster. The cavalry of the Banu Sulaym formed the vanguard of the Muslim forces, and they turned to avoid the oncoming rush of men. Normally, this would be a sound tactical decision. The cavalry was unsuited to combat in such confined spaces. However, the troops stationed behind the horsemen panicked on seeing their allies falling back, and started slowly edging backwards themselves. A quick strike by some small bands of soldiers proved successful at dislodging the enemy archers on the sides of the wadi. However, the bulk of the coalition infantry, charging at full tilt, hit the Muslim column like a hammer. The weight of this charge was too much for the disorientated column to bear, and the Muslim army broke almost immediately, the soldiers routing and fleeing towards the safety of Mecca. In the space of a few minutes, Muhammad had watched his army crumble around him, and was suddenly faced with the prospect of another Uhud, just as he had accomplished all his ambitions. He had resolved himself that he would never allow such a defeat again, and so he steeled his resolve and rode into the fray himself. With him went his closest companions, Abu Bakr, Umar, Ali, as well as his uncle Al-Abbas, and even Abu Sufyan, the man who had defied him for so long and now held his horse's reins. Together with his companions and those of his cavalry who had remained, Muhammad blocked off the path of the wadi, stemming the tide of the coalition momentarily. This group fought on, even though they were being slowly pushed back and in danger of being completely surrounded, hoping that their actions would inspire the rest of the army to rejoin the fight. Al-Abbas, with his loud voice, was tasked to call to their fleeing comrades, even as enemy horsemen threatened to overrun the defenders' position. He called on them individually by their tribe and clan, reminding them of their families and their duty to God. Those routing Muslims, seeing their prophet and their leaders fighting on the front lines, rallied back to their banners, turning around and rejoining the fight with a newfound resolve burning in their hearts. Their momentum checked by the counterattack of the rallied soldiers, the coalition forces began to give ground before the relentless fury of the Muslims. Their ranks had become disorganized during the initial attack, and the discipline and fervor of Muhammad's warriors began to take a bloody toll on their numbers. Muhammad himself would fight in the front lines, throwing dust and rocks in the eyes of the enemy, cursing and taunting them, saying, "May your faces be covered with shame." A final attempt at a breakthrough by the coalition cavalry was brushed aside by Muhammad's reserves, who rushed in to fill the gap they'd created, and their last hope of victory was dashed. All at once, the breaking point was reached, and the army of the coalition collapsed, its soldiers fleeing as fast as their feet would take them, abandoning their compatriots in a desperate race to escape the slaughter behind them. So total was this rout that the Muslim soldiers were able to run unchecked through their enemy's camp, capturing the women, children, food and possessions the fleeing tribesmen had left behind. The casualties suffered by the coalition forces were staggering for the time, with perhaps as many as 500 falling to Muslim blades, spears and arrows, and piles of corpses dotting the bed of the Hunayn Wadi. Muslim casualties of the battle are much harder to calculate, with both Ibn Ishaq and al-Tabari listing only 4 definite fatalities among their ranks. While the message that the Muslims lost far fewer men is clear, it's likely that actual casualties were quite a bit larger at minimum, possibly because only the Muslims of importance were listed, maybe somewhere between 15 and 50. The survivors of the Alliance army at Hunayn split into 2 groups after the battle. The smaller of these groups headed back in the direction of Hunayn, hoping to ambush the Muslims in their moment of triumph. The ambush was sprung, but was handily defeated soon after fighting began. The second, larger group headed south to the walled city of Taif, the home of one of the main tribes of the coalition, the Banu Thaqif. Muhammad would give chase to this column and besiege Taif for 20 days, employing again the engineering skills of Salman the Persian to construct a rudimentary catapult. The siege ultimately ended in a withdrawal due to the impatience of the Muslim soldiers. However, understanding the futility of their situation, Taif would eventually submit to Muhammad anyway and embrace Islam of their own accord. The last great bastion of resistance to Islamic expansion in Arabia was finally pacified, 11 years after its people had first expelled Muhammad in a hail of stones. Now that security had been truly established for his people, Muhammad was finally able to focus on his goal of building a prospering Islamic community that would be strong enough to last through all the trials and tribulations the future may throw at it. He would spend the next few years dictating the remainder of the Quran that would serve as both a spiritual and physical guide to his followers to the present day. His teachings would bring about a drastic improvement in Arabian society, promoting stability, providing safety to the poor and destitute, breaking entrenched hierarchies and aristocratic norms, and encouraging, from his point of view, a more moral way of living. Muhammad's time in the fires of battle was well and truly over, though he continued to organise raids across the peninsula to bring more tribes into the Muslim fold, and a large expedition north to protect against the Byzantines. He would never again be involved in a large-scale, life-or-death battle. In the year of 632, weary from the many trials he had faced over his life, he embarked, along with 100,000 of his followers, on one final pilgrimage to the Kaaba. This would define the rituals and traditions of the Hajj, that good Muslims with the means to do so should attempt to emulate at least once in their lives. On this pilgrimage, he would give one final sermon to his followers at the top of Mecca's Mount Arafat. He exhorted them to keep their faith in God strong and not be led astray by evil, to abandon their ancestral feuds, hold no ethnicity above another, uphold the rights given to women, and to follow the teachings he'd left them. At last, he ended his farewell sermon with the final words to be added to the Quran. "This day I have perfected for you your religion, and fulfilled my favour unto you, and it hath been my good pleasure to choose Islam as your religion." Muhammad would return to Medina soon after his pilgrimage was complete. Knowing that his health was beginning to fail, he would take this time to finally allow himself to rest. A few months later, he would come down with a fever, and, lying in the arms of his wife Aisha, he would pass away on the 8th of June, 632 AD, at the age of 63. In the span of 20 years, Muhammad had left for himself a legacy that would last for millennia. Through his role as a prophet, he had spread his religion far and wide, uprooting the status quo and transforming the lives of believers across Arabia. As a commander, he'd guided his people through a bloody conflict, faced insurmountable odds and come out victorious, taken his armies from the highs of the mountain to the lows of the trench, and finally cemented their place in history forever. Muhammad's death would lead to a period of strife within the Islamic community, as there was no heir apparent to take his place, and many of the subjugated tribes would take this opportunity to rebel. However, the flame of Islam would in the end refuse to be snuffed out, and over many generations, Muhammad's legacy would stretch across the whole world, from Morocco to Java, East Africa to Central Asia, until we reach our time today, where a quarter of the people on Earth would look to him for guidance and inspiration in their everyday lives.